The story always reminds me that when we're caught in the storms and in the big changes of life, how do we not live in fear? And how do we adapt? And how do we pivot? How do we not be paralyzed by changes? One of the changes that we've recognized around us and we talked about in church was just the number of our friends and people we know who no longer have celebrations of their life. There's no longer public gatherings because and so their life comes to an end, and there's no public way to say, we miss you. We loved you. So we had the celebration of life yesterday for Barb's mom, and people gathered and said, thanks for being part of our lives. We had a celebration of life for Joyce Nicholson, and who's part of our Cameo group, who's a long time associated with this congregation. And we said, thanks for all that you've contributed to each of our lives and to the life of the community. So, sorry. When we heard that Noreen Lee had died, and that there might be a service, and there might not be, we didn't know any details, we thought, let's take time in our regular service to just say thank you and to celebrate her life. So I reached out to her family and let them know that we were going to do this, and so they sent a little bit, an enlarged version of the obituary, and so let me remind you about Noreen, and you can just kind of paste the pictures and just let them put them up one at a time, okay? Thank you. So Noreen was born in Victoria to Charles and Toy Chan Kent. She was the 7th oldest child of 14. She eventually moved to Vancouver, and she worked as a secretary bookkeeping for a small wholesale import company. Her life changed when she met Duncan on a blind date at the Cave. They shared a long-distance romance as Duncan would travel from Victoria to see her, and Nortz, as she was called, would fearlessly drive in the dead of night to pick up her dashing beau from the old CPR terminal. After a long 5-year courtship, they married in 1951. Noreen's marriage produced 2 daughters and a son, who sadly passed away as a preemie. She helped Duncan with his greenhouse business and would later work for Kmart in the lingerie department. After retiring from working, Noreen took up golf as both she and Duncan joined the Gorge Vale Golf Club. They would travel with friends on golfing vacations in Canada and the US. Noreen delighted in her 3 great-grandchildren. She also enjoyed long walks around her home, playing bridge online, mahjong, and listening to audio books. Though her sight was challenged, it didn't prevent her from insisting on doing her own cooking, cleaning, and gardening. She loved to tend her garden as Duncan originally planted flower beds along the jogging path behind their house. It brought her and others great joy every spring when the flowers bloomed. She will be remembered as the light of our lives, and her spark will continue in all those lives she touched. That is true. We have chose to remember and celebrate Noreen's life on this day of celebrating diversity, because Noreen just kept coming to this church, even though she was one of very few people with Chinese background, and I can't imagine what that would be like to have very few people in the community around you that looked like you did. But certainly we'll hear in the film the tenacity of the various groups of Chinese who immigrated to Canada, to BC, to Victoria, and all that they've contributed to life. Now, she and May Chow were very good friends, and May remembers her having been significantly impacted by the Vancouver Chinatown, where she worked. And so even though she's born here in Victoria, she actually had very Chinese ways in some things, and was very entrenched in not entrenched, but she was very rooted in the Chinese tradition. Now, her family spoke about the flower beds that were along the jogging pathway. So here we have from Arlene in our congregation, Arlene Galloway Ford, who said, "I met Noreen when I picked her up a few years ago to go to the Advent Women's Lunch. That is when I found out that it was her garden we admired when we walked by on our trips around the Cedar Hill Golf Course chip trail." Even though she had difficulty with her vision due to macular degeneration, she obviously kept busy with keeping up on the news, cooking. She gave Arlene a jar of her special cranberry sauce recipe and brought dishes of food to the Advent lunch. She played bridge online with others, and she also really enjoyed music. Arlene remembers especially that her willingness to give Arlene lessons about geraniums and how to keep them over the winter. She gave her a demonstration in her greenhouse beside her house. She was a keen gardener and talked about how she and her husband had run a nursery for years in Gordon Head. Arlene said, "I enjoyed my times with Noreen, who had a long association with St. Aidan's and had previous years had been quite active in the life of the church. But unfortunately, because of her eyesight, she had trouble reading the words for the music and that. So she moved her attendance to about once a month. So Jude Bolden picks up on a time when Noreen was very active. And Jude says, "I became friends with Noreen shortly after my arrival at St. Aidan's in 1976, but got to know her so much better when we worked together on the team that was put together when the St. Aidan's congregation made the decision to sponsor a family from Vietnam, the Boat People. Jean McKenzie was our fearless leader, myself and Noreen Lee, and a couple of others who are no longer with us. Noreen was an integral part of this team as she was familiar with the language and the customs and offered us great insights in the decisions we had to make in so many areas around healthcare and education and housing and all that entailed. For months we worked hard, especially getting the small home we rented in Esquimalt to make it livable for this family of 8 who were soon to arrive on our doorstep. Noreen was our welcoming committee as she gathered at the airport to welcome this tired and fearful family from so far away. Noreen ushered them back to Jean McKenzie's home so that they could select clothing that they had gathered for them, and then they got them settled in their home. The father and husband of this family was Keen, who became the caretaker here for many, many years, for over 25 years. Well, there was lots to do in those early days with the family, and Noreen, in her kind and caring way, helped to make this transition go as smoothly as possible, because she could contribute so much. So we want to celebrate Noreen's life, all that she faced, all that she contributed. We celebrate the way by the end of her life, we all knew her as a caring and a very much a lady who was very generous with others. There's a theme in her life about how she really could take someone who didn't know how to grow things and help them become better with plants. And you can ask Julie about that if you want to know more, because Julie and Richard and May and Noreen and Ibs and Min Avery often were a little group that were hung out. So we celebrate her life. We recognize that it would not always have been easy. And we have no idea of what she would have encountered as a person who is both born here but was part of a visible minority of people here. So we celebrate her life. We give thanks for all that she has offered and all that her presence has meant to us. And I guess we commend into God's loving care her spirit, and confident that her spirit is still helping to grow and nurture new life in whatever the next realm looks like. So we learn from each other and we celebrate our connections, and let's sing In Christ